Hello and welcome to this review of my Keychron K8 keyboard. This was a donation from Keychron. It's the third Keychron I'm reviewing even. I've previously done two Q series keyboards, but unlike previous times, it was me approaching them for a review rather than the other way around. And the reason is simple: this is a contactless keyboard. Of course, it also gives me a nice opportunity to talk about the K series, which is very different from their Q series. Whereas that one is a more upmarket, custom-like range of keyboards, the K is the more standard, basic version aimed more at the average keyboard user rather than at true keyboard enthusiasts. I've had quite a few requests to review a K, so this should be good. Probably the main difference in pricing comes from the fact that this uses a chassis that's half plastic rather than a full aluminium one. This one costs $89, discounted to $62 at the time of writing, which is a very good deal for a contactless keyboard. So the Qs I reviewed were expensive chassis coupled with normal switches, whereas this one is the exact opposite. It's a cheaper chassis with high-end switches. As far as I know, this is the only model so far that they produce that uses contactless switches. Specifically, it uses Gateron KS-22 version 2 optoelectrics, which I've done a teardown video about somewhat recently. Contactless switches like optoelectrics eliminate the contact rubbing present in electromechanical switches like Cherry MX, which generally causes them to be extremely smooth. It's like typing on little clouds. As I'm specialized in interesting and exotic switches, I tend to jump on boards like this, and contactless switches are among my favorites, as I generally get extremely good results with them. I hadn't reviewed this specific switch before. There are three reasons why I find this design particularly interesting, even for a contactless switch. First of all, they're quite cheap to buy at less than 15 cents a piece from Keychron, an amazing deal considering how high-end this switch is. Well, from a technical perspective, these switches are very simple because there's no electronics in them at all, but still, this is a nice advantage to have. I'm told Gateron opto boards are compatible with Utemu optoelectric switches as well, but I can't confirm that firsthand. Second, and much more importantly, it comes with tactile and clicky versions as well as linear, which is somewhat of a rarity among contactless switches. Now, the reason for this is that contactless switches tend to become contact-based again when you make them tactile or clicky, depending on the design, but that kind of eliminates part of the advantage as you reintroduce friction into the mechanism. Of course, you still don't have the normal contact rubbing, but nonetheless you lose some of the smoothness inherent in most designs. The tactile version of this switch is even worse. That actually puts in fake contacts to rub against to create a tactile bump, which is mega lame. That completely misses the point, I think. Third, and perhaps most interestingly, the clicky version uses a tiny, almost microscopic click leaf instead of the more common click jacket design that is present in MX-type clicky switches. This means it becomes more of an Alps-like design, although I wouldn't go as far as to say that this is really the same as Alps, it's just a step in that direction. Still, this was very interesting as Zeal PC's Clickies switches, spelled with a Z, already took a big step towards an Alps-like design, and that turned out terrific. So I took a bit of extra time for this review because I wanted to do it right. I gave myself a full week with the linear switches and a full week with the clickies. They're still in clicky now, although I left the F keys and nav keys linear, so I could have a quick reference ready if I needed it. So the switches are, as is pretty typical for contactless switches, pretty light, 45 grams at actuation. That's good. I like my linears light personally, although I think it is a good idea to make the spacebar a bit stiffer, or it's easy to accidentally hit it. I think that's always a good idea when working with light switches, by the way. You can get black ones weighted at 60 grams, and even extra light yellow linears weighted at just 35 grams, although this board doesn't have adjustable actuation, so I think that would be very tricky to use. They are releasing a new Q1 with Hall effect switches in a bit that will have adjustable actuation as well, which sounds very interesting. I might have to review that one too. The clickies are super intriguing. When I came back from holiday, I put them in, and for the first 2 days or so, I forgot that they used a click leaf rather than a click jacket, and I was thinking that this actually felt pretty good and that I might have to adjust my opinion on click jackets, but then I remembered it isn't, and then it made a lot more sense. Compared to an Alps click leaf, it's absolutely tiny, and they don't feel and especially sound the same, but they definitely have the same snappy, clean feel that you can almost only get with click leaves. In fact, despite the tiny size of the leaves, they're pretty damn tactile. They're good, I like them. They're a bit stiffer than MX Blue as well, at 60 grams of force at actuation, which is kind of mid-weighted. Somehow they're a tad harsh on the fingers. I think it wouldn't have hurt if they put the tactile bump slightly higher up. Currently it's at 2 out of 4 millimeters. But really, it's a nice switch, I'd say. Let's do a sound comparison to show you that it's really not Alps. It's been a while since I busted out the old Acer, so let's compare the sound of the Keychron to that of Blue Alps real quick. Yeah, I agree, it's not quite on the same level, especially in terms of bass. But at least, like click bars, the sound is crisp and it doesn't rattle, unlike MX Blue. The board is also hot swappable, so you can easily replace switches that have gone bad, which is a very nice advantage. That said, contactless switches tend to be extremely reliable, so this should barely ever be necessary. Still, it's nice to have, even if just because that way you can easily switch them from linear to clicky or vice versa. I also do want to comment about the smoothness of the linears, as that's one of the most important parameters of linear switches in my opinion. Now, for extremely smooth keyboards, like most contactless ones, it becomes impossible to compare them at some point because there's just too little friction. So compared to, say, this Wooting 2, it's similarly god tier, although the weighting is a bit different and the feel as well. Some switches have what I refer to as a buttery feel, which means you feel friction, but it's very smooth. It's the kind of feel that you get from some switches that are lubricated, whereas others I describe as airy, which feels like a complete lack of friction at all, and the Wooting feels buttery while this one feels airy. It's almost effortless. Now, smoothness is generally not a big criterion for clicky switches unless it's really terrible, because the tactile bump tends to mask friction, but these ones are pretty smooth too. That's another reason that you don't often see contactless switches in clicky versions, but it's nice to have regardless. I'd say the big win of this type is the click leaf mainly. Now, about the board itself, it does make some concessions there, I think. Not that it feels badly made, quite the contrary, but I would have done some things differently personally. This is the semi-aluminium one, which costs a little bit more than the mostly plastic base model, but it also comes with this hideous wraparound thing here, which I really can't stand the look of. The non-aluminium one doesn't have that, and while it looks very plain, it also looks infinitely better. Build-wise, it's pretty okay. It weighs in at about 870 grams sans cable, or in imperial units, about 29 dicks. That's apparently what you measure in. That's kind of average, I reckon. Not bad, but it's not the aluminium brick that the Q series is, obviously. But then again, you do save a lot of money on this front. The RGB is pants. It's very boring, very dim, and it's not the highest quality I've seen either. I just switch it off, frankly. Or if you must pick some monochrome color, this mixed RGB effect is horrible. It looks like a regurgitated fruit salad. The keycaps are lasered ABS, which is very cheap. I don't like the tininess of the font personally either, and it comes with Mac keycaps by default, which is revolting. Then again, this board is so cheap you can easily just buy a new set and it would still be a good deal. I'm also not a fan of how close the F key row is to the rest of the board. This is really too close, I think. I much prefer a standard distance, not just to make it less likely to hit multiple keys, but mainly to make the different keys easier to spot and feel out. It's especially difficult because the keycaps are almost monochrome. Thankfully, they did put in a dedicated print screen button though. Basically, every other space-saving layout immediately throws out the print screen key for some reason. Do people not use this as something? Personally, I use it all the time, so it's nice to have it here. It also comes with 2 physical switches for the Windows/Mac and corded/wireless settings. I'm a big fan of this compared to vague keyboard shortcuts myself. They're right next to the USB-C port. Interestingly, they only provided a side port for the cable, which can be a bit annoying if that conflicts with your setup. It comes with an angled cable by default, and I strongly recommend using that because using straight cables like this very easily leads to the keyboard becoming unplugged if you so much as touch the cable. It comes with collapsible keyboard feet as well, 2 sets no less, with different heights, and they're both even rubber shod for less noise and more purchase on your desk, which is a very thoughtful addition. I like that. Overall, this keyboard is pretty good. No adjustable actuation, unfortunately, and this rimmed version is super butt ugly, I think. The rimless one looks way better, or better yet, a tip for Keychron, make the rims look like the ones on your Q series. But it performs quite well, and the price point is simply amazing. I think this is very hard to compete with. Just $62 bleeding for a contactless keyboard, and a pretty good one at that. Honestly, I think this is a really quite a nice choice for if you want to try out contactless, or if you want a contactless keyboard that's clicky, which there aren't a lot of really, let alone with click leaves rather than jackets. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.